Route 9, 3 miles from the estate, late afternoon. A car lies twisted in a deep ditch, smoke curling into the trees. I am Jane Williams, and I am clawing my way out of the wreckage. My knees are scraped raw, my ribs are screaming, and my phone is lighting up with messages from my family telling me to stay away. They wanted me to disappear to save their perfect image. But as I pedal a rusted bicycle toward the white gates of my sister's wedding, I realize I'm done hiding. I'm not walking into a celebration. I'm walking into a crime scene, and I am the evidence they tried to bury. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The bicycle chain was rusted, catching with a rhythmic grinding clack, clack, clack that sounded less like machinery and more like a clock counting down my own humiliation. My knees were scraped raw, the skin angry and weeping blood that had begun to dry into the fabric of a dress that used to be silk and was now just a ruined rag. Every time my right foot pressed down on the pedal, a sharp, hot wire of pain tightened around my ribs. I wasn't crying. I had passed the point of tears about 4 miles back, somewhere between the ditch where I'd left my car and the gas station where I'd begged for this bike. I was simply breathing, forcing air into bruised lungs, focused entirely on the white wrought iron gates looming ahead. To anyone driving past, I must have looked insane. A woman in her late 20s, wearing formal wear that looked like it had been through a shredder, pedaling an undersized, mud-caked mountain bike down the shoulder of a pristine country road. But to me, looking at the venue ahead, the scene wasn't quirky or funny. It was a crime scene. It was a place where the truth was actively being buried under layers of white florals and expensive acoustical arrangements. Ahead of me lay the grand estate chosen for my sister's wedding, a sprawling manor that cost more to rent for the weekend than most people earned in 5 years. I could see the valet line snaking around the circular drive, a parade of black luxury SUVs and sedans. I could hear the faint, perfectly tuned strains of a string quartet drifting on the wind, warring with the grinding of my bike chain. Most people would have turned back. Most people would have looked at the blood on their shin and the grease smear across their collarbone and decided that today was a loss. But I couldn't turn back. If I didn't show up, I ceased to exist. That was the rule in the Williams family. You were either perfect or you were invisible. And I was done being invisible. The disaster had started 2 hours earlier on a stretch of 2-lane highway that wound through the heavy woods surrounding the venue. I had been driving carefully, my dress hanging in a plastic garment bag in the back seat, anxious about being 5 minutes late. I was always the one walking on eggshells, terrified of disturbing the carefully curated atmosphere my parents projected. Then a charcoal sedan merged aggressively from a blind turnout, cutting across the double yellow line. I jerked the wheel. It was instinct, a split-second neurological misfire that saved my life, but killed my car. I hit a patch of loose gravel and debris, remnants of recent roadwork, and the world tilted. The tires lost their grip and the car spun a violent, sickening rotation that ended with a bone-jarring impact as my front axle slammed into the deep culvert on the shoulder. Silence followed. Absolute, ringing silence. The airbag hadn't deployed, but the seatbelt had locked so hard it felt like it had cracked my sternum. The other driver didn't stop. They corrected their swerve and accelerated, a blur of charcoal disappearing around the bend. I sat there for a moment, shaking, tasting copper in my mouth where I'd bitten my tongue. My phone mounted on the dashboard had cracked, a spiderweb fracture running diagonally across the screen, but it still lit up. I didn't call 911. I didn't call a tow truck. Not yet. I called my mother. It's pathetic to admit that now, but the conditioning runs deep. When you're raised in a cult of image, your first instinct isn't survival, it's damage control. She answered on the second ring. The background noise was a chaotic mix of laughter and clinking silverware. The rehearsal brunch was winding down. Jane? Her voice wasn't warm. It was clipped, stressed. Where are you? The photographer wants the immediate family lineup in 45 minutes. Mom, I said, my voice trembling. I was in an accident. Someone ran me off the road about 10 miles out. There was a pause. No gasp. No, Are you hurt? Just a sharp intake of breath, the sound of annoyance. Is the car drivable? No. The axle is broken. I think I'm okay, but I'm bleeding a little and my dress is in the back. Jane. She cut me off, her voice dropping to that lethal whisper she used when she wanted to strangle me without smudging her lipstick. We have 300 guests arriving. The senator's wife is already here. If you show up looking like that, don't show up at all. The line went dead. I stared at the cracked screen, the rejection sitting heavy in my gut. I dialed my father. Surely he would care about the logistics, if not the blood. Make it quick, Jane, he answered. Dad, I wrecked the car. Mom just hung up on me. I'm stranded on Route 9. Figure it out, he said, his voice flat, distracted. I'm dealing with the caterer. Do not make a scene today, Jane. Not today. Click. I sat in the ruined car, the smell of burnt rubber and radiator fluid filling the cabin, and I realized something that should have been obvious for decades. They didn't care if I was safe. They cared if I was presentable. They would rather I vanished into the woods and bled out than arrive imperfect and mar the visual symmetry of their golden child's wedding. This wasn't a one-off event. This was the pattern. It was the architecture of my entire life. Sitting there, gripping the steering wheel, 3 specific memories flashed through my mind, rapid fire, stinging like paper cuts. First, my high school graduation. I had graduated with honors, but on the morning of the ceremony, my mother had walked into my room, looked at the cream-colored dress I'd bought with my own savings, and sighed. She didn't say, "Congratulations." She walked over, pinched the fabric at my waist, and said, "It pulls at the hips, Jane. You look stuffed. Try to stand behind your father in the photos." I spent the entire day hiding my body, the achievement of the diploma completely overshadowed by the shame of my own shape. Then the family Christmas party 3 years ago. I had just gone through a brutal breakup, and my eyes were red. When a cousin asked if I was okay, my father interrupted before I could speak. "Jane is just the sensitive one," he announced to the room, raising his glass with a chuckle. "She feels things very loudly. It's best to just let her be dramatic." He turned my pain into a parlor trick, a quirk to be laughed at so the party wouldn't be uncomfortable. And finally, the time I broke my arm falling off a swing set when I was 10. I remember walking into the kitchen holding my arm at a grotesque angle, sobbing. My mother didn't rush to me. She looked at the kitchen clock and frowned. "We have dinner reservations in 20 minutes, she said. "Go wash your face. We'll go to the ER after we eat if it still hurts." I sat through a 3-course meal with a fractured radius, silent tears leaking into my napkin because inconvenience was the only sin in our house. I didn't do anything evil to deserve this. I wasn't a criminal. I wasn't cruel. I just failed to perform perfect. I was the variable they couldn't control, the messy human element in their curated existence. That realization is what made me force the door open. I climbed out of the ditch, dragging my garment bag. The dress inside was wrinkled, but I put it on over my injuries right there on the side of the road, discarding my ruined jeans. I wasn't going to hide. I checked the rideshare apps. Nothing. The venue was too rural. The road closures for the event had messed up the GPS routing, and the surge pricing was astronomical, not that a driver was available anyway. I started walking. A mile down the road, I found a small gas station with a mechanic's bay attached. The mechanic, a guy with grease-stained hands and a kindness in his eyes that I hadn't seen in my own family for 20 years, looked at me like I was a ghost. "Miss, you need an ambulance," he said. "I need a ride," I told him. "I have to be at that wedding." He couldn't drive me. He was the only one on shift, but he pointed to a rusty mountain bike leaning against the air pump. "It's my daughter's old beater. Brakes are soft, but it rolls. You can take it." So I rode. I rode because the alternative was letting them erase me. I rode because if I didn't show up, they would tell everyone I had flaked, or had an episode rewriting history to make me the villain yet again. And now here I was. The final stretch. The wedding itself was a masterpiece of consumption. My sister Emily wasn't just a bride, she was a brand ambassador. My parents were the PR team. This wasn't a celebration of love, it was a $180,000 identity statement. Every orchid, every linen napkin, every gold-rimmed glass was a brick in the fortress of their social standing. They worshipped control. They believed that if you spent enough money and smiled wide enough, you could curate reality itself. I pedaled past the valet stand. The attendants in their crisp red vests stopped moving. One of them dropped a set of keys. A well-dressed couple getting out of a Bentley stared at me, their mouths slightly open. I didn't stop. I kept pedaling right up to the main entrance, the gravel crunching loudly under the thick, knobby tires of the bike. I swung my leg over the frame and stumbled as my feet hit the ground. My legs felt like jelly. I let the bike crash to the ground, a clattering heap of rusted metal against the pristine paved drive. The music seemed to falter. A hush rippled through the gathering crowd near the entrance. I stood there, chest heaving, blood drying on my shin, my hair wind-blown and wild, my dress stained with road dust. I looked at the grand double doors of the manor. I wasn't walking into a wedding. I was walking into my assigned role. I was the disaster. I was the embarrassment. And for the first time in my life, I was going to let them see exactly what they had created. The silence that followed the crash of my bicycle against the pavement wasn't empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and distinctly social. It was the sound of 300 people collectively deciding to pretend they hadn't seen something gauche. I stood there, my chest heaving, a drop of sweat tracing a line through the road dust on my cheek, and watched the reaction ripple through the crowd like a virus. It started with the guests nearest the entrance. A woman in a pale lavender gown glanced at me, her eyes darting to the blood drying on my shin, and then immediately looked away, turning her back to engage her husband in frantic, hushed conversation. A man in a tuxedo smirked, a quick, cruel twitch of the lips that said, "Look at the trash trying to get in." They didn't gasp. They didn't rush over to help. They just adjusted their standing circles to exclude the visual contamination. Then the perimeter breached. My mother didn't run. Running would suggest panic, and panic was for poor people. She detached herself from a conversation with the officiant and glided toward me across the gravel. Her movement was smooth, predatory, a heat-seeking missile wrapped in champagne-colored silk. My father trailed a few paces behind her, his hands clasped behind his back, scanning the perimeter like a security guard assessing a threat level. My mother stopped 3 feet away from me. She didn't look at my eyes. She looked at my torn hem. She looked at the grease smear on my collarbone. She looked at the bicycle. "You look homeless," she said. Her voice wasn't a scream. It was a low, vibrato-less hum that carried only to me. It was a weaponized whisper honed over 20 years of practice. "Do you have any idea who is here? Do you want people to think we raised you like this?" "I was run off the road, Mom," I said, the adrenaline starting to fade, leaving behind a cold, shaky exhaustion. "I walked 2 miles before I found the bike." "Lower your voice," she hissed, a smile plastered on her face for the benefit of the onlookers. "You are hysterical. You are making this about you just like always." My father stepped up beside her. He didn't look at me either. He was looking past me, calculating the sightlines from the valet stand. "We need to move her," he said to my mother, as if I were a piece of furniture delivered to the wrong address. "Take her through the catering entrance. Get her out of the front drive." "Come," my mother commanded. She reached out her manicured fingers, digging into the soft flesh of my upper arm, right where a bruise was already blooming from the seatbelt. I winced, but she didn't let go. She steered me away from the grand double doors, guiding me toward a side path lined with high hedges, the path meant for servers and delivery trucks. I stumbled along with them, the gravel biting into the thin soles of my flats. We bypassed the cocktail area, slipping through a heavy steel door into the service corridor. The air changed instantly from the scent of jasmine and expensive perfume to the smell of industrial dish soap and reheating appetizers. "Stop," my mother said, releasing my arm. We were in a narrow hallway cluttered with stacked chairs. She looked me up and down with undisguised disgust. "You cannot go out there in that." "I don't have anything else," I said. "My clothes are in the wreck." "I anticipated something like this," she said. It was a lie, of course. She hadn't anticipated a car wreck. She had just brought a backup plan in case I showed up wearing something she deemed insufficiently flattering. She gestured to a garment bag hanging on a rolling rack near the staff lockers. "There is a spare dress. Emily's backup for the bridesmaids. It's a size 4. It will be tight, but it's better than looking like a vagrant." I looked at the dress. It was a muddy beige chiffon, shapeless and high-necked. It wasn't a dress meant to make someone look good. It was a dress meant to make someone disappear into the background, to be a piece of beige scenery behind the bride. It was also 2 sizes too small. "Mom, I can't fit in that. My ribs are bruised. It'll suffocate me." "Then don't breathe so deeply," she snapped. "Put it on, and wash your face. You look deranged." Before I could unzip the bag, the door at the end of the hallway swung open. Emily walked in. My sister, the bride, the brand. She was breathtaking, I'll give her that, a vision in white lace and structural perfection. But the moment she saw me, the ethereal glow vanished. Her eyes narrowed. She didn't look at my bloody knee. She didn't look at my shaking hands. Her face did a rapid calculation, a complex algorithm of optics and aesthetics. "Oh my God," Emily said, her voice flat. "Is she going to be in the photos?" "We're handling it," my father said soothingly. "She's going to change and stay in the back row." "The lighting is set for the reception entrance in 20 minutes, Emily said, ignoring him and speaking directly to the air above my head. "If she's limping, it's going to throw off the procession. Can we just have her seat already filled? Maybe she can just sit in the back for the ceremony and skip the walk." She wasn't asking if I was okay. She was asking how to edit me out of the frame. "I'm sorry," I said. The words tumbled out automatically. A reflex drilled into me since toddlerhood. "I'm sorry I exist. I'm sorry I take up space. I'm sorry my pain is inconvenient. I'll stay out of the way, I promise." As soon as the words left my mouth, a wave of nausea hit me. I hated myself for saying them. I was the one who had almost died in a ditch, and I was apologizing to the people who had told me to figure it out. "Just get changed," my mother said, turning her back on me to adjust Emily's veil. That was when the heavy steel door opened again. This time it wasn't a caterer. Grandma Margaret stood in the doorway. We called her Maggie. She was 78, barely 5 feet tall, and possessed more gravitational pull than the rest of the family combined. She wasn't the soft, baking type of grandmother. She was sharp angles, iron gray hair cut into a severe bob, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She was leaning on her cane, not out of frailty, but like she was grounding herself to the earth. Behind her stood a man in a dark gray suit, Mr. Henderson, her longtime attorney. The hallway went silent. My mother straightened her spine, her face shifting instantly from cruel manager to dutiful daughter. "Mother," my mom said, her voice raising an octave. "We were just dealing with a little situation. Jane had a bit of a mishap." Grandma Maggie didn't look at my mother. She didn't look at Emily. Her eyes locked onto me. She scanned the blood on my shin, the bruise darkening on my arm, the road rash on my cheek. She looked at the beige dress in my hand. Then she looked at the service entrance door. "I saw a bicycle out front," Grandma said. Her voice was calm, but it had an edge like a blade wrapped in velvet. "I saw a young woman riding it, who looked like she had clawed her way out of a grave. And now I find her in the service corridor." She stepped forward, the cane tapping rhythmically on the linoleum. She stopped in front of my parents. "Why is Jane bleeding at my granddaughter's wedding?" she asked. It was a simple question, but it sucked the air out of the room. "She had a flat tire or something," my father mumbled, shifting his weight. "She's fine. We're getting her cleaned up." "A flat tire doesn't leave bruises like that," Grandma said. She turned to me. "Jane, come with me." "Mother, we really need to get her ready," my mom interjected, stepping between us. "The ceremony starts in—" I said. Grandma interrupted, her voice not rising in volume, but dropping in temperature. "She is coming with me, now." She gestured to Mr. Henderson, who held the door open. I dropped the beige dress. It landed in a heap on the dirty floor. I walked past my mother, past my father, past Emily, who was still checking her reflection in the back of a spoon. I followed Grandma. She didn't take me to the bridal suite. She took me to the venue's library, a quiet mahogany-paneled room, far from the noise of the string quartet. She closed the door, locking out the wedding. Mr. Henderson stood quietly by the window, placing a leather briefcase on a side table. "Sit," Grandma said, pointing to a leather armchair. I sat. The adrenaline was completely gone now, replaced by a throbbing ache in my ribs. Grandma pulled a chair close to me. She reached out and took my chin in her hand, tilting my face to the light. Her touch was gentle, clinical. She inspected the cut on my cheek, then looked down at my knee. "You need stitches," she said quietly. "But the bleeding has stopped." She looked me in the eye. "Tell me exactly what happened. No editing, no protecting them." I looked at her. For the first time all day, I felt like I was being seen by a human being. "I got run off the road," I said. "Car is totaled. I called Mom. She told me not to come if I looked like this. I called Dad. He told me to figure it out, so I got a bike." Grandma stared at me. She didn't gasp, she didn't cry, she just got very, very quiet. It was the kind of silence that precedes a hurricane. She let go of my chin and sat back, her hands gripping the head of her cane so tightly her knuckles turned white. "They told you not to come," she repeated. It wasn't a question. "They said I would embarrass the family." Grandma looked at Mr. Henderson. He nodded once, a solemn, grim confirmation. Then she looked back at me. "I brought Arthur," she said, nodding at the attorney, "because I expected behavior. I expected them to be dismissive. I expected them to be vain. But I did not expect them to leave you in a ditch." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded sheaf of papers. She placed them on her lap. "Jane," she said, her voice hardening, "they have been spending your life like it is theirs, and I have let it go on too long because I didn't have the proof until this morning." "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. "Spending my life—" "The settlement," she said. I frowned. "What settlement?" "7 years ago," Grandma said. "When you had that reconstructive surgery on your knee, the botched surgery from the sports injury in college. You remember the lawsuit?" "Yeah," I said. "But Dad said the case was dismissed. He said the hospital had too many lawyers, so we dropped it." Grandma's face twisted in a look of pure, unadulterated fury. She looked at Mr. Henderson, who stepped forward. "The case was not dismissed, Jane," the attorney said. His voice was dry, factual. "The hospital settled out of court to avoid the publicity. They paid out $165,000. The funds were deposited into a custodial account your parents managed because you were technically under their insurance policy at the time, and they claimed you were incapacitated during the recovery." I felt the room spin. $165,000. That money would have paid off my student loans. It would have fixed my car. It would have meant I didn't have to work 2 jobs for the last 5 years. "Where is it?" I whispered. "They moved it," Grandma said. "They transferred it incrementally into the Williams Family Trust. That's the slush fund they use for appearances, for the vacations, for the country club dues." She paused and her eyes were like flint. "And last month they liquidated the remainder of it." "Why?" I asked, though deep down, looking at the floral arrangements outside the window, I already knew. "The wedding," Grandma said, "the venue deposit, the catering, the flowers, your sister's dress." The air left my lungs. I wasn't just the black sheep. I was the bank. They had stolen my pain, literally the compensation for my physical pain, and used it to buy the white roses and the string quartet that were currently drowning out the reality of who they were. They were celebrating their golden child with money they stole from the scapegoat. "They stole it," I said. It wasn't a question anymore. "Yes," Grandma said. "And they think they're safe because they believe you don't know it exists, and because they think I'm just an old woman who writes checks." She tapped the papers on her lap. This, she said, is a copy of the settlement agreement Arthur dug up from the court archives, and this, she tapped a thicker document, is an amendment to my living trust. I signed it this morning in front of a notary with a capacity letter from Dr. Evans attached. Capacity letter. To prove I am of sound mind, she said sharply. Because when I do what I am about to do, the first thing they will scream is that I am senile. She leaned forward, grabbing my hand. Her grip was iron. I am not just giving you the money back, Jane. I can write you a check for the theft. That's easy. But money runs out. I am giving you a way out. I am giving you the power to stop them. She looked toward the door, toward the sound of the wedding march starting up in the distance. They think they can manage you, she said. They think they can hide you in a beige sack and make you apologize for bleeding. We are going to show them that the bill has come due. She stood up, wincing slightly, as her knees took her weight, but she didn't waver. Wipe your face, she said. Don't put on that beige dress. You go out there exactly as you are. Let them see the blood. It matches the crime. She handed me a tissue. I wiped the dust from under my eyes. I looked at the blood on my shin, the grease on my collarbone. For the first time, I didn't see a mess. I saw evidence. Are you ready? She asked. I stood up. My ribs screamed, but my head was clear. Yes, I said. I'm ready. Good, Grandma said. She opened the door. Then let's go to a wedding. The cocktail hour was held on the West Terrace, a sprawling expanse of limestone overlooking the valley bathed in the golden hazy light of the setting sun. It was the kind of setting that photographers would call magical and ethereal, but from where I stood leaning against a stone pillar near the bar, it felt like a stage set for a play. Everyone knew the lines too, but me. Servers in white jackets moved through the crowd with trays of tuna tartare and champagne weaving seamlessly between men in $5,000 suits and women whose jewelry cost more than my entire college education. I hadn't changed. I was still wearing the torn dress, the dried blood on my shin, dark and crusty, the road rash on my cheek, vivid against my pale skin. My mother had tried to have security remove me twice already, but both times Grandma Maggie had simply stood next to me, her hand resting on the head of her cane, and glared the guards into retreat. Her presence was a force field. No one wanted to be the one to physically drag the matriarch's granddaughter away while the matriarch watched. So instead, the room pretended I wasn't there. It was a masterclass in social exclusion. Guests would drift toward me, see the bruises and the dirt, and their eyes would slide off me like water off oil. They would pivot mid-laugh to face the other direction. My parents were working the room frantically, their smiles too wide, their laughter too loud, trying to draw attention away from the walking car wreck in the corner. Emily was posing for photos near the fountain, her back rigidly turned to me, her perfect white dress a stark contrast to my ruined reality. But the tension was building. You could feel it. It was a static charge in the air, heavier than the humidity. People were whispering. They were glancing at my parents, then at me, then back at my parents. The narrative that Jane was unstable, or had an accident, wasn't holding up against the visual evidence of my neglected injuries and my parents' aggressive indifference. Grandma checked her watch. It was a men's watch, heavy gold, something my grandfather had worn. She nodded to Mr. Henderson, who had been standing silently by a high-top table, nursing a glass of sparkling water he hadn't touched. It's time, Grandma said softly. She didn't wait for the speeches. She didn't wait for the cake. She chose the moment of maximum comfort, when everyone was relaxed drinking and feeling secure in their social standing. She walked to the center of the terrace near the microphone set up for the jazz band. She didn't ask for permission. She simply tapped the microphone stand with her cane. The dull thud-thud amplified over the speakers, cutting through the chatter. The band stopped playing. The conversation died down, rippling into silence from the center outward. My mother froze mid-sip of her champagne, her eyes widening as she saw who had the floor. "Good evening," Grandma said. Her voice was steady, magnified, clear. She wasn't shouting. She sounded like she was presiding over a board meeting. I am Margaret Williams. Most of you know me. I am the one who wrote the check for the venue you are standing in. There was a polite, confused titter of laughter. People thought it was a toast. I am proud of this wedding. Grandma continued, her eyes scanning the crowd, landing briefly on Emily before moving on. It is beautiful. It is perfect. But I am less proud of the things we bury to make it look that way. I am less proud of how my granddaughter Jane has been treated today. My father started moving. He was halfway across the terrace, a tight, panicked smile fixed on his face. Mother! He called out, his voice jovial but strained. Let's save the toasts for dinner, shall we? Grandma didn't even look at him. She gestured to Mr. Henderson, who stepped up to the microphone, opening his leather portfolio. He looked out of place among the florals and the silks, a grim reaper in a charcoal suit. I am Arthur Henderson, he announced, his voice dry and devoid of emotion. I am Mrs. Williams's attorney. I am here to execute an immediate amendment to the Williams Family Trust effective as of this morning. The word trust hit the room like a physical blow. In this crowd, money was the only religion, and the trust was the Holy Scripture. My mother dropped her champagne flute. It shattered on the limestone, the sound surprisingly loud in the stunned silence. Arthur, what are you doing? My mother hissed, abandoning the pretense of politeness. She rushed toward the microphone, my father right behind her. This is a wedding. You can't do this here. The amendment is already filed, Mr. Henderson said, ignoring her. He began to read from the document, his voice monotone. Due to a breach of fiduciary duty regarding the misappropriation of settlement funds belonging to Jane Williams. A gasp went through the crowd. My parents stopped dead. And a demonstrable pattern of financial and emotional neglect. Henderson continued. Margaret Williams has removed David and Susan Williams as trustees. They are stripped of all control over the family assets, effective immediately. My father's face went purple. This is insane. You can't do that. Furthermore, Henderson read on, relentless. The primary beneficiary of the trust is hereby designated as Jane Williams. She is also appointed as the sole trustee of the real estate holdings, including the primary residence currently occupied by David and Susan Williams. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't just money, it was power. Grandma had just handed me the deed to my parents' house and the keys to their bank accounts in front of everyone they tried to impress. As for the remaining beneficiaries, Henderson looked up, his eyes meeting Emily's across the terrace. Distributions to David, Susan, and Emily Williams are now conditional, subject to the discretion of the new trustee, Jane Williams. And finally, this amendment contains a strict no-contest clause. Any beneficiary who challenges the validity of this trust or attempts to litigate these terms will be immediately and permanently disinherited. My mother lunged. It was a desperate, animalistic movement. She grabbed the microphone stand, trying to wrestle it away. She's senile! She shrieked, her voice cracking the polished veneer, finally shattering. She spun toward the guests, her face twisted. My mother has dementia. She doesn't know what she's doing. She's been confused for months. This man is taking advantage of her. The guests recoiled. It was ugly. It was raw. Grandma didn't flinch. She reached into her purse and pulled out a single sheet of paper. She held it up. Doctor, Evans evaluated me at 9:00 a.m. this morning, Grandma said into the mic, her voice cutting through my mother's hysterics. This is a certificate of medical capacity. It is notarized. It is time-stamped, and it states that I am perfectly sane. My father stepped in, trying to physically herd Grandma away, his hands reaching for her shoulders. Mother, stop this. We will handle this privately. You are making a scene. Grandma slammed her cane onto the limestone floor. The sound cracked like a gunshot. No, she said, and the authority in her voice stopped him cold. Private is where you have been getting away with it. Private is where you stole your daughter's settlement money to pay for this party. Private is where you left her bleeding on the side of the road because she didn't match the color scheme. She turned and looked at me. Jane. It was an invitation. I pushed off the pillar. My legs were shaking, but not from fear. I walked through the parted crowd. People who had looked through me 5 minutes ago were now staring at me with a mix of horror and fascination. I walked up to the microphone. My father looked at me with pure hatred. My mother was sobbing, not tears of sorrow, but tears of rage. I took the mic. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I remembered Mr. Ballin's voice in my head, calm, factual, describing the evidence. "I'm not going to ruin the wedding," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, raspy but steady. "I just want to clear up why I look like this." I pointed to my torn dress. "I was in a car accident 3 hours ago. My car is in a ditch on Route 9. I called my mother." I looked at her. She was trembling. "She told me not to come if I was injured. She told me I would embarrass the family." I looked at my father. "I called my dad. He told me to figure it out. So I rode a bike here, because I thought being here mattered." I paused, letting the words settle over the crowd like ash. "This isn't new," I said. "This is a pattern. For 28 years I have been the secret you keep so you can pretend you're perfect. You stole the money from my leg surgery money that was legally mine to pay for the family image. You bought these flowers with my pain." My mother opened her mouth to scream again, but the look on the faces of the senator's wife and the other VIPs stopped her. They looked disgusted, not at me, at her. "I'm done," I said. "I'm not arguing about reality anymore. The records exist. The bank transfers exist. The trust is legal. And I am done being the canvas you paint your lies on." I handed the microphone back to Mr. Henderson. The silence was deafening. It was the sound of a social execution. I turned to walk away, and that was when Emily intercepted me. She had come down from the fountain, her face flushed, her eyes wild. She grabbed my arm, the bruised one. "Why would you do this?" she hissed, her voice a poisonous whisper, shaking with self-pity. "Today on my day. Why would you do this to me?" I looked at her. Really looked at her. For years I had made excuses for Emily. It's the pressure, it's mom and dad, she's a victim too. But looking at her now, furious that my trauma had interrupted her pageant, I realized she wasn't a victim, she was a participant. I pulled my arm out of her grip. "I didn't do anything today, Emily," I said loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "I just stopped protecting you." I walked past her. That was the moment the dam broke. My mother, seeing the judgment in the eyes of her friends, seeing the social capital she had hoarded for decades evaporating in seconds, lost it. She didn't faint. She didn't cry elegantly. She lunged at me again, screaming, "You ungrateful little bitch, after everything we gave you." My father had to restrain her. He wrapped his arms around her waist as she flailed, her face contorted into a mask of pure, ugly malice. And everyone saw it. The mask was gone. The polished, perfect Susan Williams was replaced by a woman who would attack her injured daughter at a wedding. A woman in a blue silk dress. Mrs. Galloway, the head of the local charity board, my mother was desperate to chair, stepped back. She took a distinct, deliberate step away from my parents. Then she turned her back on them completely. It rippled through the crowd. People turned away. They checked their phones. They signaled for the valet. The party wasn't over, but the illusion was dead. The social authority my parents wielded, the fear they used to control their world, had dissolved. They were just mean, petty thieves in expensive clothes. I walked toward the exit. I passed the string quartet, who were staring at their sheet music, terrified to make a sound. I passed the valet stand. I didn't look back. I could hear my mother still screaming my name, a shrill, desperate sound that faded into the evening air. I walked out of the gates past the line of luxury cars. I felt light. My ribs still hurt. My knee was throbbing, and I had no car, no ride, and no idea how I was getting home. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying their weight anymore. I was just Jane. And that was enough. The adrenaline crash was worse than the car accident. It hit me about 20 minutes after I walked out of the gates, standing on the dark shoulder of the county road, clutching a phone that was vibrating so constantly It felt like a live wire in my hand. The notifications were a blur of names, aunts I hadn't spoken to in years, cousins who had ignored me at the reception, and overwhelmingly, my parents. 37 missed calls from Mom. 12 missed calls from Dad. A string of texts from Emily that ranged from, "I hate you," to, "Please come back, people are asking." I didn't answer any of them. I sat on a guardrail shivering as the night air cooled the sweat and dirt on my skin. I wasn't waiting for them. I had called Sarah. Sarah was my one real friend from college, the only person I had kept in my life despite my parents' constant attempts to isolate me from people who didn't advance the family brand. She lived 40 minutes away. She made it in 30. When her Honda Civic pulled up headlights cutting through the gloom, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt broken. Sarah didn't ask questions. She got out, took one look at my torn dress, the dried blood on my knee, and the 1,000-yard stare in my eyes, and she opened the passenger door. "Get in," she said. I brought a blanket and a bag of ice. As we drove away, leaving the glow of the estate in the rearview mirror, my phone lit up again. A text from my mother. "We are having a family meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. You will be there. We need to fix this narrative before it ruins us." I stared at the screen. The narrative. Even now with their financial necks in a noose, they were worried about the PR spin. I typed back 2 words, "No, unavailable." Then I turned the phone off. The next 48 hours were a blur of logistical triage. I didn't go back to my apartment. I stayed on Sarah's couch. I went to urgent care to get my knee stitched and my ribs taped. The doctor asked if I was safe at home. For the first time in my life, I could honestly answer, I am now. But the real shift happened on Tuesday morning. I didn't go to the family meeting at my parents' house. Instead, I walked into Mr. Henderson's office downtown. Grandma Maggie was already there, sitting in a wingback chair, looking tired but immovable. The meeting wasn't a celebration. It was a transfer of weight. Mr. Henderson laid out the reality of what had happened on that terrace. This wasn't a lottery win. It was a job. "The amendment is irrevocable," Henderson explained, sliding a stack of documents across the mahogany desk. "You are now the sole trustee of the Williams Family Trust. That includes the investment portfolio, the liquid assets, and the real estate holdings." "The house?" I asked, my voice catching. "The one they live in." "Technically, the trust owns the deed," Henderson said, adjusting his glasses. "Your parents have life rights to reside there, subject to the trustee's discretion regarding maintenance and upkeep costs. Meaning, Jane, you are their landlord. If they want to repair the roof or redecorate the sunroom, they have to submit a request to you." The irony was so sharp it almost cut. The people who had controlled every inch of my existence, who had critiqued my body and my choices since birth, now had to ask my permission to paint a wall. "They are already trying to contest it," Henderson added. "Your father called me at 6 this morning threatening to sue for undue influence." "What do we do?" I asked, feeling a spike of the old fear. "We do nothing," Henderson said calmly. I reminded him of the no contest clause. If they file a single legal motion challenging the trust, they are automatically disinherited. They lose their stipend. They lose the house rights. They lose everything. They can't afford to fight you, Jane. They are hostages to their own greed. I looked at Grandma. She had been quiet watching me read the documents. When Henderson stepped out to make copies, she finally spoke. "I owe you an apology," she said. I looked up. "Grandma, you just gave me everything. You don't owe me anything." "I do," she said firmly. "I saw it, Jane, for years. I saw how they spoke to you. I saw the difference in the Christmas gifts. I saw how they made you sit at the kids' table when you were 25. I told myself it was just their way. I told myself if I just gave them enough money, they would eventually be happy enough to be kind." She shook her head, a look of deep shame crossing her face. "I was wrong. Monsters don't stop eating just because you feed them. They just get bigger." She reached across the gap between our chairs and squeezed my hand. Her skin was paper thin, but her grip was strong. They wanted you dependent on their approval, she said. They broke you down so you would never think you could leave. Independence is your inheritance, Jane, not the money, the ability to walk away. That was the moment the guilt finally cracked. I had spent years thinking I was the problem, that if I was just thinner, richer, or quieter, they would love me. Grandma's words severed the last of that cord. It wasn't me. It was them. The consequences for the family were immediate and brutal, but they were proportional. Over the next week, the fallout from the wedding rippled through their social circle. The Mrs. Galloway incident on the terrace hadn't stayed private. The guests talked. The story of Susan Williams screaming at her injured daughter while the grandmother exposed their theft traveled fast. My mother was quietly asked to step down from the charity board she had spent 10 years trying to lead. The invitation to the governor's autumn gala, the highlight of their social calendar, never arrived. They weren't canceled in a loud internet way. It was worse. They were ghosted. They became radioactive. People simply stopped returning their calls because no one wanted to be associated with financial fraud and family cruelty. My father tried to bully me into releasing funds. He sent emails demanding emergency transfers for bills that I knew were frivolous. I didn't argue. I didn't get emotional. I simply replied strictly as a trustee. Request denied due to insufficient documentation of necessity. I used their own bureaucratic language against them. It drove them insane, but they couldn't do a thing about it without triggering the no contest clause. And Emily, that was the cracks showing the clearest. She didn't get an annulment, but the fairy tale died on the honeymoon. Her husband, a decent guy who had been swept up in the Williams family glamour, had seen the mask slip. I heard from a mutual friend that he was asking questions about the settlement money. He was looking at his new in-laws with suspicion. The marriage was starting not on a foundation of trust, but on a sinkhole of doubt. I wasn't winning. This wasn't a victory lap. I was in therapy twice a week unpacking decades of damage. I was meeting with financial advisors to learn how to manage a trust I never asked for. I was tired. But as I sat in Henderson's office signing the final papers that legally transferred the power from their hands to mine, I felt something new. It wasn't happiness. It was stability. The ground beneath my feet was finally solid. I wasn't waiting for the next blow. I wasn't waiting for permission to exist. "You're done," Henderson said, stamping the final document. I stood up. I didn't have to ask my dad for a ride home. I didn't have to ask my mom if my outfit was okay. I walked out of the office into the bright midday sun and took a deep breath. The air tasted different when you weren't holding it in. 6 weeks after the wedding, I finally agreed to meet my parents. I didn't go to the house where I grew up, the house where I had learned to shrink myself to fit into their corners. I booked a small conference room at Mr. Henderson's firm. Neutral ground, regulated ground. When they walked in, they looked smaller. That's the only way I can describe it. My mother wasn't wearing her usual armor of tailored silk. She was in slacks and a cardigan, her face free of makeup, looking tired and strangely ordinary. My father, stripped of his ability to sign checks that commanded respect, looked like a man who had forgotten his lines. They sat across from me at the glass table. Mr. Henderson sat in the corner, silent, a reminder of the new laws of physics in our family. "We just want to put this behind us, Jane," my father said. He tried to use his authoritative voice, but it faltered. "We're a family. We shouldn't be handling our affairs through lawyers. We are handling them this way because you proved you couldn't handle them with love," I said. My pulse didn't race. My hands didn't shake. "I'm not here to argue the past. I'm here to tell you the future." My mother reached for a tissue. "We did our best, Jane. You have to understand the pressure. We just wanted you to fit in. We wanted you to be happy." "No," I corrected her gently. "You wanted me to be you, and I'm not." I leaned forward, placing my hands flat on the table. "Here are the rules. If you want to see me, you ask. If you criticize my appearance, my job, or my choices, the visit ends. If you yell, the visit ends. You don't get access to me unless you can treat me with basic respect. And regarding the trust, the allowance remains as is. It covers your needs, not your vanity. They stared at me. They looked for the scared little girl they could manipulate, the daughter who would apologize for breathing too loud. She wasn't there anymore. They nodded, slowly, defeated by the absolute clarity of my boundaries. I left the office and walked into my own life. I used the settlement money responsibly, just as Grandma intended. I paid off my student loans in one click, watching the balance hit zero, with a satisfaction better than any party. I rented a small apartment on the edge of town, nothing luxurious, but it had a balcony, and more importantly, a lease with only my name on it. I also set up a small anonymous grant with the local high school athletic department to cover physical therapy costs for injured students who couldn't afford it. I didn't want a plaque. I just wanted to make sure the next kid with a broken wing didn't have to limp. The final piece of closure wasn't financial, it was mechanical. I went back to the gas station on Route 9. The mechanic was there, wiping his hands on a rag. When he saw me, he smiled. The rusty mountain bike was leaning against the wall, but it looked different. He had scrubbed the rust off the chain, tightened the brakes, and put on new tires. "I figured you might come back for it," he said. "Fix the gears. She runs smooth now." "How much?" I asked. "On the house," he said. "For the ride you took." I took the bike. I didn't put it in a car. I swung my leg over the frame. My knee was still stiff, the scar tissue a fresh pink line, but it held. I started to pedal. This time there was no grinding noise. This time I wasn't riding toward a place that wanted to hide me. I turned the handlebars toward the open road, the wind catching my hair, the sun warm on my face. They wanted me to arrive invisible. I arrived bruised, loud, in the only way that matters, still moving forward. And that is how Jane finally chose independence over acceptance, trading the gold cage for the open road. If you were surprised by how Maggie executed her revenge, or if you've ever had to set a firm boundary with family, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into complex revenge stories. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.